This is Isar-2, a nuclear power plant once capable of generating energy for over 3 million homes. In April 2023, its reactors went cold, completing Germany's bold and controversial nuclear phase-out. The timing couldn't have been more critical. As Europe grappled with an energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, critics accused Berlin of abandoning a vital clean energy source. Meanwhile, coal-fired plants belched out carbon dioxide, and neighboring France, reliant on nuclear power, lit Germany's cities. The whole thing has been kind of more about identity than energy. For decades, Germany's anti-nuclear movement has been a powerhouse, shutting down plants, blocking nuclear waste facilities, and propelling the rise of the world's most powerful Green Party. But how did any of this even happen? I mean, why is Germany so against nuclear energy in the first place? And what does it mean for the planet? Germany's first nuclear power plant in Kahl fired up in 1961. It generated around 16 megawatts of electricity, about 100 times less than modern reactors. But still, it was up and running safely. However, safety concerns were there from the start. Just a few years earlier in 1957, the Windscale fire disaster had occurred in the UK. It was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, and one that not many people know about. It was overshadowed by 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl decades later, but it was bad. It was sparked by a chain reaction in a graphite-moderated reactor designed to produce plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons program. The fire burned for 3 days, releasing radioactive iodine-131, cesium-137, and polonium-210 into the atmosphere. Milk from over 200 square miles of surrounding farmland was destroyed by the government in the aftermath, because milk is consumed fresh, so there wasn't time for the radiation to naturally decrease, making it more dangerous than other foods. The fallout spread to Europe and Germany, and so the seeds of skepticism had already been planted before the first German nuclear reactor was ever even built. But the German anti-nuclear movement really took off in the 1970s, particularly here in Wil. When a new plant was proposed here in a rural agricultural area, wine growers and farmers from the region weren't happy. After some limited protests fell on deaf ears, things got more intense once the government started breaking ground for the project. On February 18, 1975, a day after construction began, a group of people occupied the site. Police were filmed forcibly removing them from the site, dragging them through the mud. It was all captured on video and turned into a national headline. Less than a week later, 30,000 protesters occupied Wil, and mounting pressure forced the government to shut the whole project down that same year. 4 years later, the 3 Mile Island incident happened in the US. Yet another example for many Germans that nuclear power wasn't worth the risk. After the incident, 200,000 anti-nuclear protesters rallied in Hanover and Bonn. The opposition was growing. Then came Chernobyl in 1986. Germans experienced its fallout directly. Radioactive particles drifted across the continent, contaminating farmland and food supplies. Milk became a symbol of the crisis. Supermarkets charged double for milk produced before specific dates to assure customers it was safe, same as what happened with the British windfall incident. Parents panicked over tainted vegetables, fruit and meat, and sandboxes, places of childhood joy, earned grim nicknames like death boxes because of fears that the sand in them became contaminated. Even decades later, 95% of wild mushroom samples taken from Germany, especially Bavaria, still carry traces of Chernobyl's radiation, albeit not above the legal limits. By the 1990s, the German anti-nuclear movement started concentrating its efforts on opposing the transport and storage of nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is perhaps the least sustainable aspect of nuclear energy. There are a few different types. You have low and intermediate level waste, which account for 99% of all the nuclear waste generated. And then you have the high level waste, or HLW for short, which, despite being around 1% of the total amount of waste generated, accounts for over 95% of the radioactivity from nuclear power generation and requires isolation for tens of thousands of years. A single 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant produces around 27 tons of radioactive waste annually. Since the first nuclear plant became operational in 1954, over 400,000 tons of waste have been produced globally. The thing is, a lot of this waste has the potential for recycling. Around a third of all the waste generated from nuclear power has been recycled back into the system, most of it in the form of spent uranium. Though, according to the World Nuclear Association, 97% of all the waste produced could hypothetically be recycled and used in other reactors. Yet, because of things like cost and public perception, the actual amount of waste that's recycled is much lower. Instead, it's being pumped underground. Countries like Finland are leading efforts with deep geological repositories in remote areas, such as the Onkalo facility, set to open in 2025, burying waste at depths of 430 meters, or 1,400 feet, to minimize risk. Meanwhile, France and Sweden have explored similar solutions, emphasizing public engagement, with Sweden achieving 80% local support for its Forsmark repository. But it can take time to figure out how and where to pump this radioactive waste. So in the late 1970s, Germany developed something called the CASTOR cask. CASTOR being short for Cask for Storage and Transport of Radioactive Material. With a price tag of between $1 and $2 million, these casks are massive steel and cast iron containers, designed to shield against radiation while withstanding catastrophic events. A single cask, over 6 meters or 20 feet long and weighing more than 100 metric tons when loaded, can store up to 28 spent nuclear fuel assemblies, which combined would weigh about the same as a fully loaded semi-truck. These CASTOR casks became focal points of some fierce resistance. In 1996, sit-ins blocked the path of the second ever CASTOR shipment to Gorleben, a small village in Lower Saxony that was chosen as a potential nuclear waste storage site because it sits atop something called a salt dome, an underground geological formation made of rock salt that's been compressed and pushed upward through surrounding sedimentary layers over millions of years. The salt creates a natural barrier that prevents the radioactive waste from seeping out and contaminating the surrounding area, in theory anyway. The Gorleben salt dome still hadn't been approved, and tests were still ongoing, so the waste just sat in an above-ground interim storage facility nearby. A year later, thousands gathered again to disrupt the third shipment, though it ultimately arrived. These protests often turned tragic. In 2004, a young activist lost his life when a CASTOR transport train severed his leg. In 2008, 15,000 protesters staged blockades against the 11th CASTOR shipment. Throughout most of all these protests, Germany's Green Party was building momentum. It was formally established in 1980 and emerged from a whole range of grassroots movements, including environmentalists, pacifists, and anti-nuclear activists. The party's formation marked a pivotal shift in German politics, and it unified the anti-nuclear cause that had gained traction during the 1970s with protests like those in Wil and Gorleben. By 1983, the Greens entered the Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, bringing their anti-nuclear agenda to the federal arena. They saw nuclear energy as emblematic of a centralized, technocratic approach to power, in direct contrast to their grassroots, decentralized vision. The Greens achieved a political milestone in 1998, forming a coalition with the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schröder. Green Party leader Joschka Fischer became Foreign Minister and Vice Chancellor of Germany, and the Greens were firmly cemented as one of the most influential parties in the nation. This partnership between the Social Democrats and the Greens led to the landmark Nuclear Consensus of 2000, which set Germany on a path to phase out nuclear power completely. The agreement capped reactor lifespans at 32 years and banned new nuclear plant construction outright. By 2003, Germany had shuttered its Stade plant, followed by Obregame in 2005. This legislation marked the first major victory for the Greens in their decades-long campaign against nuclear energy. However, the agreement wasn't without resistance. Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, in opposition at the time, condemned the phase-out as economically reckless and pledged to reverse it if elected. When Merkel took office in 2005, she delivered on that promise. In 2010, her government extended reactor lifespans by up to 14 years, effectively pausing the phase-out. This reversal was met with immediate backlash, including protests involving tens of thousands of people. By 2011, the global nuclear debate shifted dramatically after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. The crisis reignited fears of nuclear accidents, particularly in a country as densely populated as Germany. Merkel, once a physicist and nuclear advocate, reversed course again. Her government enacted a moratorium on older reactors and legislated a renewed phase-out plan. By June 2011, the Bundestag voted overwhelmingly to close all nuclear plants by 2022. This decision was a political triumph for the Greens and reflected overwhelming public support. with polls consistently showing over 80% of Germans in favor of abandoning nuclear energy. Today, Germany's anti-nuclear stance is complete. On April 15, 2023, the last 3 reactors, Isar 2, Emsland and Neckar-Westheim 2, were decommissioned. But all of this anti-nuclear sentiment has been about more than just safety concerns. You see, in post-war Germany, a Germany that was just rebuilding after the devastation of World War II and the Nazis, the people weren't exactly trusting of authority. The scars of fascism were still very much visible, and they created a strong skepticism of centralized power and unchecked science. By the 1950s, Germany's nuclear ambitions were viewed not as technological progress, but as a potential return to dangerous hierarchies. This sentiment wasn't helped by something called the Traub eavesdropping affair. In the 60s and 70s, Klaus Traub was one of the top managers of the country's nuclear energy, working as the director of nuclear energy for the German electrical company AEG, one of the largest electrical companies in the world. But in the mid-70s, Traub had a change of heart. He became worried over safety concerns and the close ties between nuclear energy and the military, and started openly opposing it. The shift in perspective made Traub a target. In 1975, Germany's Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, suspecting him of links to the radical left-wing Red Army faction, launched an illegal surveillance operation against him. Without concrete evidence, they bugged his apartment and spied on his private conversations. The fallout was swift and severe. Traub was fired from his position at AEG under government pressure. Yet the accusations were baseless, and the operation was exposed by Der Spiegel in 1977, triggering public outrage. The scandal forced Interior Minister Werner Mayhofer to resign, and Traub emerged as a symbol of state overreach and the dangers of unchecked government power. For Germany's growing anti-nuclear movement, the Traub affair validated widespread fears about the collusion of government, corporations, and the nuclear industry. It wasn't just about the surveillance itself, but the underlying narrative, that nuclear energy wasn't just about science or progress, but about control, secrecy, and technocratic elitism. The affair galvanized opposition, and it fed into a larger distrust of authority, further strengthening the grassroots movements. Traub himself became a prominent critic of nuclear energy, lending credibility to the cause. Then, a decade later, details emerged of how the British government covered up the 1957 Windscale fire I mentioned earlier. It turned out that then Prime Minister Harold Macmillan ordered the report on the disaster, authored by leading scientist Sir William Penney, to be heavily censored. Copies of the original report were shredded, and the printers were instructed to destroy their type. Instead, the government issued a vague white paper, claiming national security interests as justification. Behind closed doors, Macmillan feared that full disclosure would jeopardize Britain's nuclear cooperation with the United States, particularly during the Cold War, when the UK's nuclear weapons program depended on American technology. When the full extent of the cover-up was revealed decades later in 1988, it added yet more fuel to the anti-nuclear sentiment in Germany, where skepticism toward centralized authority was already high. Activists and politicians drew parallels between the secrecy surrounding Windscale and their own government's promotion of nuclear energy. The fact that Britain prioritized preserving ties with the US over public safety reinforced fears that nuclear energy was inseparable from technocratic control and geopolitical maneuvering. For many Germans, the Windscale revelations were a clear warning. If a democratic ally like Britain could withhold the truth about such a critical event, how could they trust their own government and nuclear industry to act transparently? Yet all this anti-nuclear sentiment that drew from a skepticism of technocratic power post-World War II, actually helped contribute to one of the world's most effective clean energy transitions. It's called Energiewende, or energy turnaround, and it's one of the most radical energy transformations ever attempted. It was launched in 2010 with the goal that by 2050, Germany would cut its greenhouse gas emissions by up to 95% compared to its 1990 levels, and get 60% of its energy from renewables. By 2023, the country was already getting 50% of its electricity from renewables like wind and solar, driven by policies that placed citizens, not corporations, at the center of the energy revolution. It started with something called the Renewable Energy Act of 2000, which guaranteed fixed payments for renewable energy fed into the grid. This policy turned farmers into wind turbine operators, suburban homeowners into solar entrepreneurs, and small towns into power exporters. By 2016, Germany had installed over 50 gigawatts of wind capacity and 41 gigawatts of solar, making it a global leader in renewable energy. Nearly half this infrastructure was owned by individuals or local cooperatives, a decentralized model that gave ordinary Germans a direct stake in the country's energy transition. But the price tag was quite steep. Between 2013 and 2019 alone, Germany spent 160 billion euros on the Energiewende, much of it funded through higher electricity bills for consumers. German households now pay some of the highest rates in Europe, leading to criticism that the financial burden was unfairly distributed. Despite this, public support for renewables remained remarkably high, with 80 to 90% of Germans consistently backing the expansion of wind and solar. There have been some cracks in the planning though, including infrastructure bottlenecks, like delays in building transmission lines to transport wind power from the north to southern industrial hubs. And wind power has been a hot-button issue recently. Germany's wind power expansion has stalled as resistance grows among citizens and local governments. Over 660 citizen initiatives now actively oppose new wind farms, citing concerns over aesthetics, potential harm to wildlife, and declining property values. In Bavaria, a strict 10H rule mandates that turbines must be set back 10 times their height from residential areas, effectively restricting development, while in other states, court battles and regulatory delays have halved new wind capacity additions since 2018. Then there's solar. Germany isn't exactly the sunniest country in the world, and solar panels often produce around 20 to 30% of their capacity annually, compared to over 40% in high sunlight regions. Yet for all its challenges, the Energiewende redefined Germany's energy system, creating a decentralized, citizen-driven model that inspired countries worldwide. But paradoxically, Germany is one of the world's leading consumers of coal and natural gas. In the 1980s, coal powered the factories that made the country the economic engine of Europe. Massive open-pit lignite mines stretched across regions like North Rhine-Westphalia and Saxony and fueled industry and electricity. The reunification of East and West Germany in 1990 brought an even heavier reliance on lignite, also known as brown coal, as the former East's aging plants were integrated into the national grid. By the early 1990s, coal provided nearly half of Germany's electricity, with lignite alone accounting for around a quarter. As global pressure mounted to curb emissions, Germany began a slow pivot. Subsidies for domestic coal production were phased out, and in 2018, hard coal mining ended altogether, its cost outstripped by imports from Russia and the US. Yet coal's grip didn't wane. Lignite, sourced locally, kept Germany among the top CO2 emitters in Europe, even as renewables began to rise. Despite ambitious climate goals, coal consumption declined at a sluggish pace. In 2020, it still accounted for over 24% of electricity generation. Natural gas followed a similar trajectory. In the 1970s, gas pipelines from the Soviet Union began delivering vast quantities of cheap energy, forging a dependency that would grow with time. In the decades that followed, natural gas became central to Germany's industrial and domestic energy landscape. Factories hummed with Soviet gas, homes were heated, and power plants increasingly turned to gas as a cleaner alternative to coal. By the 1990s, Germany's demand for natural gas surged alongside the European Union's energy integration efforts. The reunification of East and West Germany amplified this trend, as Soviet-era infrastructure in the east meshed with the broader energy network. Imports from Russia steadily increased, cementing Moscow as Germany's primary supplier. By 2021, over half of Germany's natural gas came from Russian pipelines, a level of dependency that left Berlin vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. And that shock came a year later, when Russia invaded Ukraine. By the end of 2022, the Russian supply of natural gas into Germany had been slashed to a trickle, and the Nord Stream pipeline, once a symbol of European-Russian interdependence, lay sabotaged beneath the Baltic Sea. Faced with the looming threat of blackouts, Berlin scrambled to diversify its imports, turning to liquefied natural gas from Norway, the US, and the Netherlands. However, the shift was anything but seamless. Costs soared, and domestic industries reliant on cheap energy faltered. Even as the gas supply dwindled, coal consumption surged. In the same year, 1/3 of Germany's electricity came from coal, a sharp increase compared to 2021. Aging lignite plants roared back to life, pumping emissions into the atmosphere as nuclear facilities were shuttered. Germany's Greens, traditionally champions of decarbonization, found themselves in a paradox, endorsing coal to avoid plunging millions into an energy crisis. It's an energy crisis that has reignited the debate over nuclear power, With its last reactors shut down in 2023, proponents argue for a reversal to ease reliance on coal and gas. Critics, however, point to long-standing challenges like radioactive waste and public opposition. Reopening nuclear plants offers immediate benefits. 8 reactors could potentially be operational within a year, contributing over 85 terawatt-hours annually, equivalent to powering much of Germany's energy-intensive industries, or around 24 million households each year. This would slash carbon emissions by 80 million tons per year, offsetting coal's environmental toll. Costs are competitive, with nuclear energy production estimated at €25 per megawatt hour, far below the skyrocketing costs of gas and coal. Public sentiment has shifted too. 67% of Germans now favor nuclear energy to meet climate goals. This makes nuclear a compelling alternative to Germany's expensive and carbon-intensive energy imports, particularly as industries face high electricity prices. However, nuclear energy isn't a simple solution. Critics highlight the unresolved issue of radioactive waste, which remains a logistical and ethical dilemma. Waste disposal costs could exceed €5 billion by 2046, with storage solutions unlikely before that time. Moreover, restarting reactors require political will to amend the Atomic Energy Act, as well as securing specialized staff and fuel supplies. Anti-nuclear sentiment, deeply rooted in historical events like Chernobyl and Fukushima, persists among a vocal segment of the population. Germany's renewable ambitions are another factor. Like I mentioned earlier, wind and solar energy now supply over half the country's electricity, and continued investment could reduce dependence on fossil fuels and nuclear alike. Yet, renewables alone may struggle to meet base load demand without significant advancement in storage technology. The debate captures Germany's larger struggle, balancing climate leadership with energy security. Can nuclear power be a bridge to a renewable future, or does it conflict with Germany's vision for sustainability? The decision will shape not only Germany's energy landscape, but also its position in global climate policy. Thanks for watching.